Hello, my name is L.J. Stambuk. I'm the President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, and I'm delighted to host again Dr. Graham Allison. He was with us in 2007. You might remember he was talking about his book that came out on May 30th, 2017, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape the Citizens Trap? Great read if you have not read it. Highly recommended. Dr. Allison, thank you for being back with us here in Charlotte. It's such a delight to see you again, and I hope there'll be an opportunity soon for you to actually come in person and for us to have a conversation with you. Having said that, I would like to kind of draw your attention to a couple of things before we start the program. One, the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, as you know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that promotes dialogue on global and local issues of importance to our community. Your microphone, while we're on this program, will be on mute and your camera will be turned off for the duration of the presentation. We will have a question and answer session, and to submit a question at any time, please use the question and answer box in the Zoom toolbar that you can see on the slide. This presentation will be recorded and sent out via the World Affairs Council mailing list, so make sure you're signed up to receive our emails. Finally, important, if you do enjoy today's free program, please consider making a financial gift to help support our work at www.worldaffairscharlotte.org/giving. We do not have our live programs. There is a global pandemic. As many, we are in a situation where your support, your donations make a big difference for us. So we do hope that you would be able to either become a member or make a donation to the World Affairs Council. I will now go shortly into the biography of Dr. Graham Allison, but he asked me to basically share with you that he was born in Charlotte and is a Charlottean and loves Charlotte. And he did go, as you might know, he did go to Davidson College. What a great institution of higher education we have in our community. So we will not go at length through the biography. You can find that on our recording and our slides later on. We do want to get the maximum of Dr. Graham's time with us here today. So as I said, you can donate, you can become a World Affairs Council member, or you can increase your level of membership. It would mean the world to us. It would mean the world to the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. This is our 8th program in a row. We have all the previous recordings for you on our website. If you're interested in seeing them, please come to our website and you will find the previous programs we had. Without further ado, Dr. Allison, welcome to Charlotte. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
So thank you very much. It's a pleasure, even by Zoom, to be back with some friends in Charlotte. As you said, I'm very proud and honored that I was born in Charlotte. I grew up in Charlotte. I graduated from Myers Park High School. I went to Davidson with many of my friends and colleagues with whom I remain friends. I probably still have more close friends from Charlotte, from my growing up there, than from any other part of my life, even though I've been 50 years at Harvard. So in any case, it's a pleasure to be back. I wish I could have been there in person, because I'm sure almost the azaleas must already be over, or almost. But in any case, I'll look forward to coming back sometime in person. The coronavirus crisis has obviously captured our imaginations and attention in a way that has led us all to take a pause. The national, in effect, shutdown has left many of us at home for now 6 or 7 weeks. I suspect that since the principal target for coronavirus is the elderly, and among them especially males, maybe even some of us are remembering mortality. So that's always healthy, and since that's part of life. But my topic today, as announced, is how is coronavirus impacting the China challenge. And basically, as I see it, coronavirus is like a bolt of lightning that in the darkness illuminates for a flash the horizon, in which we can see at least the shapes of some things at a distance that would normally be obscured. And I think if I try to be succinct, the coronavirus bolt of lightning should illuminate for us three major features that will define the China challenge for the U.S. for as far as any eye can see. And these three are, first, a Thucydidean rivalry. That's the most fundamental point. Secondly, what if I was trying to think of a snappy title, I might call mini MADs, that is mini MADs, but instead of destruction, which was the MAD of the Cold War, I would just say defeat. And I'll say more about what that means. But basically, a pandemic, which is a virus that is no respecter of borders, cannot be defeated anywhere until it's ultimately defeated anywhere someone can come from to reintroduce it to one's country. So the US and China find themselves each unable to defeat coronavirus by itself. And that's not unlike what we found, or the condition we found ourselves in the Cold War. So I'll say more about that. And finally, this concept of rivalry partners, which sounds like a contradiction, but which in the business world is understood to be part of the complexity of life. So businesses sometimes talk about co-opetition, some combination of competition and cooperation. But rivalry partners, I think, it's not an elegant locution, but I think it's an appropriate characterization of the relationship that we're going to need to build with China going forward, since the alternative to finding a way to live with China will be a war in which we die with China. So that's the three bottom lines. Let me say a word about each. So first, the Thucydidean rivalry. This is what I talked about when I was there in 2017. This is the subject of a book that you mentioned, LJ, published in Memorial Day, 2017. So now just 3 years ago. And the title of the book is Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? I won't give you the presentation on the book. You can Google it, or you can see my TED Talk. That takes about 14 minutes to give you the summary. And now almost 4 million people have viewed that, so that's been a big hit. Or I would encourage you, though, to, if you haven't, get the book and read it. It's been a bestseller since it was published. And indeed, since the Chinese version was published just over a year ago, it sold many more copies in China than it has, even though it's been a U.S. and international bestseller elsewhere. Indeed, as one of the Chinese leaders put it to me the last time I was in Beijing, which was in January, he said, you must be the best public relations agent Thucydides ever had, because he's sold more copies in Mandarin of his Peloponnesian War in the period since my book was published than he sold in the previous 2,500 years since his book was published. So I said, well, I was glad for that, because you cannot read Thucydides' great work, The Peloponnesian War, too often, and you can't actually read a page or two without learning something significant. So to the first point, the coronavirus reminds us that whatever else is going on, the defining feature, the fundamental defining feature of the relationship between the US and China is a classic Thucydidean rivalry. China really is a rising power. It really is threatening to displace the US from our positions of leadership in every arena where we've been the ruling power. And the dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power is the topic Thucydides wrote about 2,500 years ago in classical Greece, where, as he wrote famously, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable. In my book, I look at the last 500 years of history. I find 16 cases, 16 times, that a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. 12 of these cases ended in war, 4 in not war. So to say that in the case of the rivalry between a rising China and a ruling US, war is inevitable would be wrong on the record. 4 of the 16 cases, no war. But to say that war would be possible, indeed war would be likely, absolutely. And in fact, if one tries to think about this relationship between the US and China today, at a minimum, we're already into a version of Cold War II. That is a struggle by almost every means other than bombs and bullets. And I think it'll be a challenge to prevent Cold War II from becoming World War III, which was the challenge in the case of Cold War I. Even with a pandemic, and even when neither state can defeat it by itself, if we look at what China has done and what the US has done, we see that coping with or managing the challenge of coronavirus itself becomes part of this underlying, fundamental, structural Thucydidean dynamic. So China, after a bungling start, for which there's no excuse, but a bungling start, finally, a month into the crisis, when they got it, its leadership got it, they acted decisively, and they've essentially defeated coronavirus inside China. So the number of new infections daily inside China is nearly zero. They have, from that point, pivoted to becoming the supplier of help and hope for everyone in the world. So who is making face masks and who is fighting for face masks? The answer is China is the biggest supplier of face masks and all other medical equipment and medicines relevant for coronavirus, and the US is the biggest consumer. So the concept even of the flow of desperately needed assistance, not from USA, which has been our role for now 7 decades, since World War II, to be the helping hand for those in desperate need, but instead from east to west. There's something wrong with that picture, but what's wrong with that picture is a good metaphor for what's actually happening as a rising China as the #1 manufacturer of everything in the world. Actually, the #1 economy in terms of size of its national economy in the world, as I described in detail in the book, as the #1 source of face masks in the coronavirus crisis. So the rivalry is an inherent, inescapable part of the relationship. And if, God help us, but I would say on the current path, if there's no change in China's trajectory and our own, where I believe our performance has been miserable right across the board, from the president to the bureaucracy to even our vaunted industry and the states and the cities. If we continue on the current path, China will have had 1 quarter of negative growth and now is bouncing back to steady growth and will not have a negative 2020. So their GDP will grow net in 2020, even though they lost about 6.5% in the first quarter. The U.S. already has had a decline 12 times faster than the economic decline we saw in the Great Depression. So the rate at which the U.S. GDP has fallen and unemployment has increased is something that at this point, in this short period of time, just if you take it 5 months to 5 months, exceeds what's happened in the Great Depression. So if we continue along the current path, we will have a negative 2020. And as the chairman of the Fed said this week, maybe not recover until the end of 2021. Well, should that happen, you'll see this widening of the spread between the size of China's GDP and the size of the American GDP. And that was the big event of 2008, when we had the great financial crisis, when the Americans had a big recession, and even we lost GDP in 2008 and half of 2009. China did not have a single negative year and actually went back to a rapid rate of growth. And that was the point at which, through that decade, China overtook the US to become the largest economy in the world. So to just finish on point 1, this is a fundamental, structural, underlying, inescapable rivalry between the rising China and the ruling US that, as Thucydides reminds us, threatens not simply Cold War, but real war. Not real war because China wants to attack the US, not real war because the US is going to attack China, since everybody in the US and China, everybody responsible for this, knows that a war between the US and China would be catastrophic. But instead, in Thucydidean rivalries, wars happen because of some third party's provocation, or even some accident, like the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo in June 1914, that within 6 months, a small spark had produced a conflagration that ended up being so devastating that historians had to create a whole new category. That's why it's called World War I. So, number 1, a Thucydidean rivalry. Number 2, despite this Thucydidean rivalry, the US and China in coronavirus each face mutually a threat that neither can defeat by itself working alone. So if one country, let's say China, but it could be the US, succeeded in eliminating new domestic infections. Still, when citizens of that country returned from the other country, or when visitors arrived from another country, they could be bringing coronavirus. So this devil will not be defeated until we finally have an effective vaccine, which may happen in a year or 18 months. If it did, as Fauci said, that would be a miracle. And we should pray for a miracle, but we shouldn't count on it. So we therefore have an analog to what I was part of in trying to understand and deal with in the Cold War in my own career. In the Cold War, we first built up a superpower nuclear arsenal, but within a decade, the Soviet Union had matched that to the point that they had a nuclear arsenal that, if used, even after we had attacked them, could still destroy the U.S. Some nuclear wizard then thought up a name for this, and it was called MAD, M-A-D, Mutual Assured Destruction. In fact, the author of it meant it as a double entendre to remind us that making your security dependent on a suicide pact was a form of madness. But since we couldn't figure out how to escape it, we did. But what it meant was, as Ronald Reagan, for whom I had the good fortune to work back in the 1980s, his favorite one-liner was, he would say, a nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought. So it's a profound idea. If we fight a nuclear war, we end up with all Americans dead. So for what end was the war? So if a nuclear war cannot be won, therefore it must not be fought. Well, in order to prevent fighting a nuclear war, I then have to behave differently in my competition, even with a Thucydidean rival, than I did otherwise. So during the Cold War, little by little, wise leaders developed a set of constraints on the competition, constraints to prevent confrontations like the Cuban Missile Crisis that could stumble from that point to a nuclear war, which we would, of course, both lose and which would therefore be a catastrophe. So in the case of coronavirus, we, Chinese and Americans, mutually face an adversary that we cannot defeat. Fortunately, it doesn't destroy us, it just kills a bunch of people. So I call it like mini, small, MAD, mutual assured defeat. This, of course, is not the only instance in which nature, as well as technology, impose on both superpowers the necessity for some cooperation or working together or compromise. Climate is a similar challenge. If either state's emission of greenhouse gases creates a disruptive climate change to the point that it would create an environment in which nobody could successfully live, then both of us would be destroyed. So finding a way for the US and China to mutually constrain greenhouse gas emissions is something that's essential, again, for both nations' well-being. So point two, whatever the rivalry, however hostile, however adversarial, both the US and China face challenges, of which coronavirus is one, that neither can defeat by itself working alone. And therefore, we have to find ways to cooperate, or at least to work together, at least to the minimum required to successfully defeat coronavirus and other such international challenges. That's point two. Finally, point three, rivalry partnership. Take Apple and Samsung, two major suppliers of smartphones. They are fierce rivals in the market for selling smartphones. And in fact, in the last 4 years, Samsung has emerged as number one and Apple number two. Actually, Huawei is another very serious competitor. But let's just talk about Apple and Samsung. So for Apple, its fiercest competitor, who's actually beating it out, is Samsung. But at the same time, who is the biggest supplier of components for Apple's smartphones? And the answer is Samsung. So do it again. For Apple, its fiercest competitor is also its most essential supplier. And if you were to ask Tim Cook, the guy that runs Apple, how do you manage this? He says, well, with difficulty. And you say, but how can you be both the fiercest rival and and how can somebody be both your fiercest rival and your most essential supplier? He says it's complicated, but life is complicated. So diplomats may not like the idea. It's certainly not part of the diplomatic lexicon, but I think we're going to have to learn to embrace something like what I call rivalry partnership. Now, the term actually comes from Chinese learnings and history. In the Song dynasty, which was about 1,000 years ago, the Song, who were ruling China, were trying to deal with a northern Mongol tribe called the Liao. And they were unable to defeat them. So they finally negotiated a treaty in 1005. It's called the Chanyan Treaty. You can Google it. And in this treaty, they agreed that they would be what historians call rivalry partners. They designated some areas in which they would be fierce rivals and other areas in which they would be thick partners. And managing that for both of them turned out to be very difficult. And the treaty and the peace that it created did not last forever. It broke down after 120 years. In Chinese history, 120 years may not seem too long, but I think from the perspective of American history, if we could find a relationship with China that would be something like a rivalry partnership, and if terms of such agreement could provide for 120 years of America surviving with our values and institutions, I would write that down as a success. So let me simply summarize. So coronavirus has not changed the world. It's simply a bright flash of light that should help illuminate for us what's actually happening in the world. Coronavirus reminds us first that the US and China are locked ineluctably in a fierce rivalry between a rising China that threatens to displace a ruling US. Secondly, at the same time, in that rivalry, we also face conditions from nature, like a pandemic or climate, or from technology, like nuclear weapons, where a degree of working together and cooperation is necessary for survival. So we have to find ways, however uncomfortable, to do that. And third, could we build, therefore, taking account of both point one and point two, a relationship that might be called a rivalry partnership? And could we define the arenas for rivalry and the arenas for cooperation or partnership? And could we manage that? I would say not easily, but not impossible. And since the survival is at stake, since the alternative is to die together, then I would say this is a path to attempt. So probably that's exactly 30 minutes, which is what you asked me to talk. So let me stop. I'd be very interested in hearing contrary views and also in Q&A. Hello?
Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Allison, thank you so much for talking to us about a very important relationship at an extraordinary time in an innovative and measured way. My name is Vikram Kumar. I'm a professor of economics at Davidson College, and I'm proud to be a member of the board of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte. Thank you, all of you, for tuning in today to listen to an authoritative voice on these matters. It's my pleasure to moderate the question and answers. And if you will write in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, then I'll do my best to read them out. And Professor Allison can then respond. So here's the first question. Given China's willful role in stifling COVID reporting, not allowing on-the-ground outside monitors, misreporting information regarding the degree and method of spread, etc., what international and national penalties do you believe should be applied to China by the UN, EU, and other international institutions? If no collective penalties are applied, what should the US consider on its own accord?
Good question and a difficult question. So I think trying to understand what the facts are at this stage is very difficult. And especially in the current hyper-political environment, many claims and charges are being made both by China and by the US, and by particularly people in the US, on the basis of very thin facts. I've tried to look into this as best I can, and I would say the facts are fairly cloudy. What seems pretty clear is that the virus emerged in Wuhan, a big city, 10 million people, in the province or state of Hubei, which is about 60 million people. And whether it came from a live market there with bats, I think that's the most likely theory. But there's also a biosecurity lab there from which it might have escaped. So that's possible. But in any case, it emerged. In the first 3 weeks or so, some combination of incompetence in Wuhan and the standard procedures of an autocratic state like China were slow to pick up on the signals. And therefore, there's no question that provided a period in which there was both a development or spreading of the virus and some people left Wuhan, since Wuhan's a big airport, and flew other places and carried the virus to other places. For a novel virus, when it emerges, there's no standard process or standard timeline for how quickly a state should identify it and act. But I think there's no question China was slow, and then once they acted, they were embarrassed, and then they created a narrative, and they've covered it up in some ways. All that seems to me to be likely to be true. But I think many of the charges about it are exaggerated. So that's point one. Point two, particularly now that we're in our presidential campaign, both from what you hear from the Trump campaign and what you hear from the opponent are mainly political ammunition, not facts and analysis. So from the perspective of the Trump campaign, it makes good sense to try to blame China to deflect attention from our failures, which I think are at least as large as China's. And since Democrats don't want to be softer on China than the president, they're going to try to say China's was slow to develop this and the U.S. was slow to call them out because Trump was being cozy with China. So we're going to see a very ugly set of charges and claims and counterclaims in which facts and analysis are not really relevant. So I think that's going to be happening. The WHO meeting occurred this week, and because we've taken a very hostile attitude in the Trump administration towards the WHO, and since the WHO is the international organization that everybody else is part of, it was not surprising that the result of the meeting was not the one that the Trump administration wanted, which was a demand for an international investigation of what China did and failed to do. Instead, the outcome was the one the Chinese preferred, which was that there be an international review of what each nation did and failed to do. So that's a, overly long answer, but I would say this is a complicated question in which the facts are still quite hazy. The Chinese behavior in covering this up and presenting a narrative that's good enough for their own population has worked for them and is working well enough for the rest of the world. And our ability to do anything about it is quite limited.
Thank you for that, Professor Allison. That question was from Brian Barger, and thank you, Brian, for that question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Do you think our president understands what you're sharing with us today?
Well, I try not to be too political. I believe we have one president at a time. I think he's the captain of the ship, and I think we're passengers on the ship. So I hope and pray that he makes the right choices, even though he's the most unusual president that I've ever seen or studied. I think there are a number of quite able people that work in the Trump administration whom I do know, some former colleagues, some former students, and some friends. And I think they're trying to deal with the issues as best they can. I think that if I look at the behavior in the China policy so far, for sure they have the idea of a Thucydidean rivalry. So they like that analysis and would say that's what they're trying to cope with. They're simply trying to make sure that our team competes successfully. On the proposition of areas of shared interest, there are some members of the administration who appreciate that, and some that don't, I think. And to the thought about a rivalry partnership, I've had a chance to talk again. I know the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, since he was a student here at Harvard Law School. And I know Matt Pottinger, who's the White House Deputy National Security Advisor, excellent fella, who does the China policies. I've talked to them about this. I don't think they necessarily agree yet, but maybe they will.
Thank you. The next question is from John Gayes. And there are actually a couple of questions about Hong Kong, so I'm going to put them both together to you. This one says, can you comment on the sweeping new national security law that China wants to impose on Hong Kong? And if I can quickly find the other one here. What role do you think that Hong Kong holds in assisting to build a positive relationship with China? As someone who has lived in Hong Kong for many years, I would hope that there could be some assistance despite the current issues in Hong Kong.
So Hong Kong, again, obviously the person asking the question knows a lot about Hong Kong. I'm a great admirer of Hong Kong. It's one of the miracle sort of city-states of the world. They built a fantastic city-state. They have whatever, 7, 8, 9 million people that have been extremely free, except for their political choices, and a very successful society, and a remarkably lively group of people. So I've found Hong Kong to be one of the sort of fascinating jewels here. And I think there's no question that Hong Kong is part of mainland China, that mainland China is ruled from Beijing, and that President Xi's government is going to continue squeezing the interpretations of their political rights that Hong Kongers have become accustomed to, and that particularly for the reformers in Hong Kong, their hopes that they were going to be the vanguard of a democratization, first of Hong Kong and then of China, have failed or have been crushed and will be crushed. So interesting how in the first round of this, before the coronavirus, the Chinese government, and particularly Carrie Lam, the chief executive in Hong Kong, the strategy seemed to be fairly clumsy. But I would say that the Chinese government has taken advantage of the coronavirus shutdown to arrest a large number of the protesters, or the leaders of the protest, at least as far as I understand, and to prevent and use the necessity for social distancing to prevent the recurrence of the demonstrations that were having such an impact. So I would say Hong Kong's future is to be more integrated into China, and that's going to be very uncomfortable for Hong Kongers accustomed to life as it had developed before the Chinese government decided to become so active in reintegrating it.
Thank you for that, Professor Allison. I have a couple of questions here about the Thucydides trap. So the first is from David Lin, and he asks, how have Chinese-based scholars of political science responded to your thesis regarding Thucydides trap and its implications related to relations between China and US? Is there any evidence of cultural and or political differences that play into the way in which we interpret the relations between both countries?
Good question, yes.
And the second question is, in your view, and this is from Wei Zhao, in your view, what should the US and China do to escape Thucydides' trap and build better rivalry partnership between two great countries?
So thank you, both good questions. So initially, well, I would say, let's start back first. The leader, the international leader who first grasped the idea of Thucydides' trap and understood it was Xi Jinping. So I published an article version of this back several years before the book. And the year before the book was actually published at Davos, Xi Jinping had a discussion of Thucydides' trap, in which his initial response was, well, there's only a Thucydides trap if the parties take the wrong actions. So we're denying that there's any inevitability of a Thucydides trap leading to war, because, and then that's when he proposed what he called a new form of great power relations. As one of the people who works directly for Xi Jinping said to me, I said, why do you think the boss calls for a new form of great power relations? And he says, it's because we understand that the old form of rivalries so frequently led to catastrophic wars, just as Thucydides wrote. So after the first round of or flurry of discussion, particularly in China, if Xi Jinping thinks something is interesting, everybody feels like they have to go read about it or learn about it. So there's been a lot of discussion and debate, both in the policy community and in the academic community. And one of the arguments that a number of academics have tried to make is that since the cases in the book, the 16 cases, 12 of them are from European history, not Asian history, that they're biased in terms of European traditions or European culture. I think that I've had that argument with a number of groups there and some back and forth. I think for the academics who like to try to make an argument that Chinese traditions are not essentially realpolitik, that's the basis on which they make this argument. But for Chinese policymakers, take somebody like the Vice President, Wang Qishan, they are ruthlessly realistic. And when they look at the world, not only the world of international history, but the world of Chinese history, they see rivalries between a dynasty and a would-be dynasty. So I think the logic of the argument is now widely accepted in the policy circles. To the question of how to escape Thucydides' trap, that's a topic I talk with them about each time, because the hunt that I've been on since I sent the book to the publisher 3 years ago is how to escape Thucydides' trap. So far, I've found 9 possible avenues of escape, I call them. But the one that I find most interesting and promising is the one that I mentioned, this idea of a rivalry partnership, or there's another twist on that, which actually has American origins. If you take the idea that President John Kennedy came to after the U.S. survived the confrontation of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Just to remind you, This was high Cold War. Khrushchev, leading the Soviet Union, had installed nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. The U.S. discovered when the missile bases were being built, but before they were operational. Kennedy insisted that this would never happen. There would never be operational nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. There was a confrontation, famously, for 13 days. Kennedy thought there was a 1 in 3 chance this would end in a nuclear war that would kill several hundred million people. So after this event, he and his brother, Bobby, spent a long time reflecting on how close they had come to catastrophe, and remembering that if there had been a catastrophe and several hundred million people had been killed, they would basically have no excuse. And they were both Catholics and worried about what they were going to say at their day of judgment. So Kennedy gave, just 5 months before his assassination, his most important foreign policy speech, which was the American University commencement speech in June of 1963. And in it, he said, well, as I think about the relationship with the Soviet Union, while I'm still committed to the proposition that America's free market democracy and the American alliance and the free world are good, and that the Soviet Union as an authoritarian or totalitarian prison is bad, nonetheless, we're going to have to work together to do what he called build a world safe for diversity. So I think if we combine the thought and the impulse and then the actions that followed from Kennedy's conception of a world safe for diversity on the one hand, and clues from the Song and Liao in the Rivalry partnership on the other, it's quite conceivable that we could build a, quote, new form of great power relations. And we should remember, in the Cold War, even though there were a number of close calls, most importantly, or most dangerously, the missile crisis, that in the end we did survive. And in the end, a system that we thought was rotten and collapsed. So I would settle for a rivalry partnership in which each nation, China with its party-led autocracy, and the U.S. with a market-based democracy, each try to show that it can govern itself successfully and provide more of what citizens want. And in that rivalry, I'm not giving up on our team. And in the partnership required to constrain the confrontations and provide enough cooperation on the areas where we have to cooperate, that seems to be potentially manageable, even though it would be very demanding for an American government.
Thank you, Professor Allison. There are many questions here, but if I may ask you to reflect on a comment from the Ambassador of Belgium to the United States, Dirk Waters. The current US administration is trying at the same time to gain influence in the international organizations in order to counter growing Chinese influence, in particular in the UN, but at the same time the US is withdrawing from agreements and organizations. Would you care to just reflect on this contradiction?
Well, it certainly is a contradiction. There's no question that China is seeking greater influence in international organizations. That was actually the US objective initially, to get China, which had been isolated, to join organizations like the WTO and organizations like the WHO and groups like the Non-Proliferation Group. So China has joined them, and as China has gotten bigger and stronger, it sought to exert more influence in these organizations. Again, that's very normal. States participate in international organizations to advance their interests, and they don't. The U.S. does, and China does. So I would say that's quite normal. What's abnormal in the Trump administration has been our abandoning these organizations, which we actually created. And while each of them have huge faults, the WHO is a great example, there's not an alternative. And when we absent ourselves and the Chinese play a more active and bigger role, we can complain that they're getting greater influence, but actually we've given them greater influence by our absence or by attempting to make the organization do things that we think it should do, but not actually investing the diplomatic effort in causing that to happen. So I would say that probably we've done more to advance China's influence in these international organizations than they have.
Thank you for that. Professor Allison, Lulie Mallard would like to know, should we have rival partnerships with other countries like Russia?
Well, if Lulie thinks so, I'm for it, yes. I think it's a good point, and the answer is, in principle, yes. Where another state's behavior is essential for my survival, they need to be a partner to the extent that we can prevent what would otherwise be catastrophic for ourselves. And in the case of Russia, while we often forget, Russia remains a nuclear superpower whose arsenal is still so substantial that even if we did our best to destroy it, they could still respond in a way that erases our country from the map. So in the national security strategy currently, the language says we face two great power competitors. One, the rising China, that's the predominant adversary. But secondly, a Russia that we're going to have to find also a way to live with if the alternative is to die with them.
Thank you for that. Chase Saunders would like to know, can you comment on the global implications of China's announcement of the enactment this week of a civil code?
A good question. I think that China has been taking small steps in many arenas, and we usually don't note them sufficiently, but as modernization theory would predict, as China's economy has become more complex, and as the market forces in China have become the dominant sources of growth, the interest in order has grown, and therefore in rules and regulations and laws. So these are all steps in that direction. And I think what remains to be seen is how they're implemented and how the judicial processes work to make it possible for to get closer to what we think of as a rule of law.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Allison. We are coming to the end of our time, and I would like to turn it over with grateful thanks to you to L.J. Stambuk, our president.
Dr. Vikram Kumar, thank you. We're so glad to host Dr. Graham Allison, Professor of Government at Harvard University, former Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Clinton, and Special Advisor to the Secretary of Defense under President Reagan. This afternoon, it was a fascinating conversation. We could go on for hours, Dr. Allison. So we do want to talk to you and talk to you again and talk to you soon. I do want to thank Ambassador Voters for coming to this event from Washington, D.C., the Ambassador of Belgium to the U.S., one of our previous guests. I understand, Ambassador Waters, that this is not your first panel that you're participating in, and we are sending you an invitation to be a speaker, distinguished speaker for the World Affairs Council in the coming months. Thank you very much. Thank you to our board members who are here today with us, many of them. Thank you for your leadership and your support. And most of all, thank you to all our members and supporters who are here with us today. We hope to see you next Tuesday with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Ambassador Ryan Crocker, one of the most distinguished diplomats in our country. He has served in many countries in the Middle East, and we had him as a guest before live in Charlotte. We hope that you will join us next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Dr. Allison, thank you so very much once again. We enjoyed your presence today with us.
Thank you. Look forward to seeing you in person before too long.
Thank you. Take care.